Welcome to the CGschool's 1-hour webinar on Photoshop Advanced. This is Lon Gross up at Neoscape Studios in Boston, and for the next hour I'm going to give you a sneak peek at what we offer in our full 2-day course on Photoshop Advanced training. In the course of those 2 days, we talk quite a bit about what you can do with color management and answer some of the questions that people have and bit depths and how do you work with files such as 32-bit files and EXRs, which is what we're going to be talking about today in this webinar. Also, what you can get out of color correction in different color modes such as RGB, CMYK, and lab. And then the standard color correction procedures of level and hue satch and color balance. But really going to be spending most of our time in curves, since that's sort of the granddaddy of all color correctors, and understanding what you can do in the histogram. Walk through all of our different transfer modes and what they do, and more importantly what they do mathematically to an image. Talk a little bit about what we can do with our filters, and as well as creating smart filters that are non-destructive. Talk about some techniques for creating tileable texture maps, and then moving on into the second day, we kind of get into a breakdown of the normal workflow, which is how do you work with layer management and mats and masks, working with some smart objects, how do you composite a scene, bringing in skies, foliage, people, and then some of the more advanced photography features such as dealing with HDR images and merging to HDRs, taking photographs and using them to photo merge for your backplates. Some image touch-ups such as the digital darkroom tools, dodge and burn, and then we jump into a little bit a precursor look to Adobe Lightroom and Camera Raw and how we can color grade with those tools. Today what we're going to do is we're going to go through a bit of how you can work with 32-bit EXR files coming out of a V-Ray render with all of its render elements, and as well as how you can bring in mats and masks with alpha channels and build a fully mathematically correct 32-bit composite. So the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to pop into Max for a second, and the scene that I'm going to open up has been rendered out in V-Ray. And the way that I've done that, one of the things that V-Ray 2.0 has added is a feature now that when you render to the V-Ray raw image file, you can now choose OpenEXR from your output. You also have the option to choose whether or not the EXR uses a full 32-bit output, or if that is not checked, it's going to use a 16-bit floating point output. And there is a big difference between 16-bit floating point and a 16-bit file, which we can talk about a little bit later. But this OpenEXR file is going to render out and give us exactly what we need. Now what we're also going to do is we're going to turn on all of our render elements that we want to bring into our composite. This list of render elements, some are redundant, in terms of they generate certain things that are already pre-generated. For instance, a path such as the raw reflection and the reflection filter, those get multiplied to turn into the V-Ray reflection. But I'm going to render out all of these so that we can bring them into Photoshop and see what we can do with them. When you render out a V-Ray EXR file here, it is going to render out all of those render elements that we selected into one single file. That's a nice feature if you have something that can open up a multi-layered EXR file. Compositing packages such as After Effects and Nuke and Fusion, those will all be able to open up those multi-channeled EXR files. In fact, After Effects has integrated a software now that was generated by these folks here at F-Nord Software. And that is a program called ProEXR. So in the latest versions of After Effects, this comes installed. But for those of you that are using Photoshop, and that's what this class is about, we actually have to have a separate plugin for Photoshop in order for it to see all of the multi-layered elements inside of a single EXR. Now, if you don't have ProEXR, you can certainly go ahead and render out your separate channels but what you'll want to do is you want to save out your separate mats as or your separate elements as individual files. I find that to be a little bit cumbersome because for every rendering then we've got you know, a whole slew of different files that we need to keep track of. So the beauty of containing it all within one EXR is that you only have one file to find. So I'm going to go ahead and close down Max here just to save a little bit of system resource. And I'm going to open up Photoshop CS5 64-bit. Now there's a couple things to be aware of. I'm opening up Photoshop CS5 Extended, and it's very important that if you're going to try to attempt to work with 32-bit files, oh, that's great, Max decided to crash on exit for me. When you open up 32-bit files such as EXRs, you're going to want to use Photoshop Extended for the simple fact that you will be able to use layers in those files. Without Extended, you're not able to layer 32-bit files. So I've got the Pro EXR software installed here for Photoshop, and so when I go to open up my EXR file that I'd rendered, which is called terrace.exr, and I hit open, it's going to ask me a couple of options of what I want to do. It's going to say, do I want to cut out the alpha channel, or do I want to keep it on a separate layer? And I'm going to go ahead and keep my alpha channel on a separate layer. Go ahead and hit OK. And assign it my working profile. Great. So here's the rendering that I've created. And what you'll notice is I've got all those render elements that I selected are over here in my layer stack. Now, as I mentioned, if you're not working in 32-bit, or if you're not working in Photoshop Extended, you're not able to create layers over here in the stack. You would be able to open them up with layers, but you would not be able to generate them. So, a couple of things that I need to do just to start off the bat. Now, when I'm working in a 32-bit file, because I'm working in float, I have the ability, and down here is my exposure slider, I have all of this information that's baked into my scene, which is really great from a compositing and color correction standpoint. For instance, and if I double click, it'll just reset back to 0. If I want to up the exposure on some areas, if I want to get back some detail, I have that. So rendering out your files as 32-bit images is like camera raw on steroids, really. So that's a great thing to do. So up top here is my beauty pass. I've got an alpha channel. In my alpha channel, I'm just going to actually move to my channel. So I'm just going to grab that, copy it, go to channels, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it into an alpha. Guess I should have pasted it in alpha 1, but that's okay. And that's just because I don't necessarily want to have it in my stack, but I want to keep that available for when I have a selection. I've got a specular pass, a self-illumination pass, which doesn't have any data in it right now. So I'm actually going to go ahead and delete my self-illumination pass. But if you were creating a full composite, let's say it was a nighttime shot or you had some glowing objects, you'd want to keep that self-illumination in there. I'm just going to delete it to save a little space. I've got a refraction filter, refraction, reflection filter, reflection, and all my raw passes, my GI, lighting, and then the diffuse filter. Okay, so we want to start building our composites, and like I mentioned in the beginning, I've got a few too many things. I've actually got enough here to do 2 different types of composites. So the first one that I'm going to do is I'm going to separate all of these ones that are not raw. So I'm going to take my V-ray refraction, my reflection, my lighting, my global illumination. And I'm going to take all of those and include my specular, and with those selected I'm going to hit Control G and group them into Comp A. Now, just looking at these pieces, let's talk about what we can do. my global illumination is going to be my base layer here. This is that layer, that render element that shows just what happens from the GI. And then my lighting is what's happening with my lighting layers. Well, the lighting, if I put that on linear dodge and I add it, that's going to be the correct composite for those two elements. And actually the same goes for the reflection and refraction. So I'm going to go ahead and add my refraction. I'm going to add my reflection. Put that on add. And this little bit of specular highlight's not going to make a whole lot of difference, but we'll go ahead and put that on add as well. And then what I can do is I can turn on my RGB. This is my beauty channel. And if I turn that off, you'll notice that my images are identical except for one little tiny spot. And I'll zoom in and show you what that is. When I originally put this file together, I hadn't gone through and double checked that every single material was set to a V-Ray material. And V-Ray really wants you to go ahead and use all of those great options for V-Ray materials, and in this case I had used a standard blend instead of a V-Ray blend material, and that explains the difference just on these couple of vases here. But for all intents and purposes, we've just been able to take and separate out our lighting, reflection, refraction, specular, put those all on separate layers and build up the comp exactly the way that it would be had we rendered it out that way. Well, let's go ahead and build up another version of this. I'm going to go ahead and take all of these elements and hit Control G, and I'm going to group these into Comp B, and this is going to be my raw. Now this one gets a little bit trickier, and there are a couple of finite details that that we talk about in the class, but just for the purposes of illustrating what the power of this is in our 1-hour webinar segment here, I'm going to focus on some ways to put this together easily and make some changes that we can measure and go back in and render. So my V-Ray diffuse filter is, I'm going to go ahead and turn off Comp A. The V-Ray diffuse filter is that render element that is just the material surface coloration and texture on it. There's no lighting on it, there's no shading, it's only what that color is. Well, in order to get at our global illumination layer, and this is our raw GI layer, and that looks pretty nice. Nice and clean in most spots. We've got a couple of little areas that maybe we would want to work on a little bit. Well, this raw GI layer, when that gets multiplied by the diffuse filter, that essentially becomes what we had up here in our global illumination layer. So let me go ahead and take these two pieces here together, and I'm going to go ahead and group them and call it GI. And I'll take that and multiply it. Find multiply there. So now when I look at my GI layer compared to my GI layer here, you'll notice that they're identical except for a couple of alpha channel things that are happening because I'm overlaying this on top of it. But that's exactly mathematically what's happening under the hood in V-Ray to produce this. Well, what's nice about being able to control this separately is that my diffuse filter, if I wanted to change a color inside of one of these objects, let's say I wanted to change the paint color of this terracotta, I could easily render out a matte and then go in and make a mask selection in this layer with a color correction layer and literally change the color as if I were changing it the way that I would in Max. Now, that's really great because then you can get at that solid color without affecting its lighting properties and adjusting some of those things that get overlaid onto it. Well, this V-Ray diffuse filter actually gets used in a couple of occasions. The next occasion it gets used in is on top, it gets multiplied by this V-Ray raw lighting. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to take my diffuse filter and I'm going to right click and I'm going to convert this to a smart object. And what that does is that my smart object now, anything that I do to this image, if I double click on it, it's going to open up my separate smart object here. If I add a layer on top of this, let me just go ahead and make an adjustment layer, and let's say I put a hue saturation on it and I want that to be really desaturated. And then I go ahead and close this and I say, yep, go ahead and update that. Well, what I've done is I've adjusted this and done it non-destructively, but also if I copy this up and I make my another group and I call this light, and I take my raw light and I multiply it by that. Now anytime that I adjust this smart object, so if I go in here and I get rid of this hue saturation and I close it down, it's updated both of these instances. So when I was describing before to you that anything that you would do to change the color here if we rendered out a mask, well, what I could do is I could actually go into my smart object, I could use my mask and adjust the color. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and open up one of my mats. I've got a couple other mats in here, so why don't I get those open at the same time. Great. So the one that I'm after is I want to take whatever is green here and I want that to become an alpha channel. So this matte technique I've rendered out just straight fully illuminated red, green, and blue channels. And the reason that I've done that is because I can get at those alpha channels. I can get at those channels individually here. So if I go ahead and I take what was on that green channel and I drop it into a mask here, and I do a color correction but with that selected. So let's say I want to do a hue saturation on this, and I want that color to be more saturated, maybe tweak it just a little bit. I can go ahead and do this in my smart object, and then when I close this, it's going to, as long as I hit yes, it's going to update it in both of these locations in my comp. And let me just go ahead and show you that there's no difference between our original and our second. So that's a nice feature. That's sort of like a pre-comp almost in After Effects. Well, let's continue to work on our composite, and I'll hide these for a second. Okay, so my GI is a combination of my diffuse filter multiplied by raw GI. My lighting is a combination of my raw lighting multiplied by my diffuse filter. And to put these two together, I'm going to take that group and I'm going to add it on top of it. So now we're starting to get what our results want to look like. Well, similarly, my reflection and refraction are the same. So if I take my refraction and my refraction filter and I select those together and hit Control G, I can call this refraction. Same with reflection. These all get multiplied by each other as well. So I'm going to take this and put it on multiply, take my reflection overall and put it on add, and then rinse and repeat here. Put my refraction on multiply, and the group, put that on add, And then the difference is that I need a copy of my specular here. And if we wanted to follow what we did before by making a smart object, so I'll convert that to a smart object. And now anything that I do to this specular will change in this one as well. Specular doesn't get multiplied by anything, but I am going to go ahead and just put it in a group here for consistency's sake so that we're organized. So my comp B should look identical to my original RGB. Let me turn off comp A. So there's my original RGB, and there's my comp B. And for the exception of just a few alpha channel things, because I'm turning this on without turning that off. But our vases are the only culprit there that, as I explained before, are the only difference. So now what we've done is we've basically built a full setup out of our raw passes very, very easily from, let me just close this down and open up my layer so we can see it a little larger. And here's where the fun begins. Well, the first thing that we want to do is we want to grab our channel back here and get my alpha channel. So I just went to channels, I hit control and selected it, and now I'm going to turn that into a mask on top of my whole comp there. So that takes that alpha channel and it applies it over my entire comp. Let's say, for instance, that I wanted to go in here and adjust the amount of transparency of this pool. Well, the transparency of that pool is controlled by this refraction filter. And just to make it easy to see, I'm going to make a copy of my refraction filter up here. And I'm going to turn it on normal so that we can just look at it. So what the refraction filter is it's simply a grayscale value that tells that gives an amount to multiply against what the raw refractions are going to be. So let me just make another copy of my raw refraction, and I'm going to put that on normal. So my raw refraction looks like this, and maybe I'll just expose it a little bit more so that we can see better on the screen. What that is that's my 100% see-through value. So this is what that looks like with a complete transparency. And what it does is it gets multiplied by this value, which is close to very transparent, but not entirely. And if I actually select these values, you can see up here on my RGB slider the amounts that those are. And because this is a index of refraction on this water of 1.33, you'll see as I get further up, my transparency becomes less. And so these grayscale values can be changed and then multiplied back against your raw refraction, just as if you were to adjust the amount of transparency or reflection, let's say, in max. So go back to normal exposure down there, and let's do it with reflection. So I'll make a copy of my and the only reason I'm making a copy here is just because I think it's a little easier to see and compare. Make sure that both of these are on normal. Okay, so this is what the raw reflection pass looks like, and this is a little easier, I think, to visualize for people because it looks fairly obvious. Each one of these surfaces gets rendered out at 100% reflective, albeit 100% reflective, but also controlled by whatever maps are controlling them. So you can see that there's some texture map here on this surface that's giving it some, there's a little bit of bumpiness and glossiness and so on to it. And you look at our water here, you can see the slight rippling in the water, but 100% reflective. Well, that gets multiplied by these values here, which are our reflection filter, and So the reflectivity of the water is being controlled by these grayscale values in here. Well, just like we had done before, if we wanted to go into our matte, and we've got our red, green, and blue values in here for the RGB. I want the green values, and so I'm going to bring that in. And if we want to adjust the amount of reflection in this water, I'm going to go ahead to my reflection filter down here, and I'm going to adjust I can either, if I wanted to just put a solid color over it, that would make it uniform. If I did an exposure or a levels, I can start to adjust it that way. So you see, as I bring up my levels of my water, I'm making it more reflective. So we're essentially seeing less through that. Well, what's also pretty neat, if I make another copy of this and just bring it up above what we were looking at before. Get rid of these two layers that I don't need. If I put this on normal, what I've done is I've created a different grayscale value that I can actually measure. So I can see that my lowest value here is 150, 147, and it's a gradient up to 255 as I get close to here. And what I can do with those values is I can actually go to max and input what I find here. I can measure these values and then input them directly into the material shader inside of Max and V-Ray, and they will render out the next time exactly the way that that we had hoped they would. So that's one really cool way to go about working on your scene, tweaking some values in post relatively quickly, and then if the result is good enough, then that's fine. You go ahead and export that out as your final image. But if you were going to have to render it again, for instance, if we change the color of this terracotta dramatically, well, that would affect the color and of the light that's bouncing off of it. So we wouldn't be able to recreate that necessarily in post. We wouldn't be tinting our global illumination values, but we'd be able to measure what we thought looked good, and then next time we rendered it out, it would look the way we'd hope. So let's do a couple of other things here with our scene. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring in a sky as a backplate. So I've got a sky.dng here. And this is just a photograph that I took recently on a trip to Florida. And the DNG file stands for digital negative, and it's a really great, fantastic Photoshop, or it's a great Adobe format for Camera Raw. Well, this file opens up directly in our latest version of Camera Raw. And for those of you that saw my 1-hour webinar on advanced architectural photography, we spent a lot of time in Lightroom, and Lightroom's a great addition to your arsenal, but for those of you that have Photoshop, you've got some of these tools also at your disposal, and in this case it's Camera Raw. And Camera Raw is a really excellent place to work on color balancing your image, going through your temperature. So let's take a look right now at some of the features of Camera Raw. Well, the first thing that we have is we've got a white balance, and the white balance we can either set manually by adjusting these sliders, or even picking a white balance tool here and selecting the area on the image that we feel should be a middle gray, a mid-tone neutral. We can also choose to go automatically correct it, and you'll notice that and when I shot this, it was a very blue, clear, clear blue day, and you'll notice how the histogram has changed here between as shot and how it changed. And so it's trying to warm up the image automatically, making up for the excess blue. In this case, though, I actually prefer uh, the color balance of where I shot it, so we can leave it alone. We can also tint it if we wanted to bring it more towards the magenta or more towards the green and the cyans. We also have the ability for it to adjust our exposure automatically, and you'll notice again when you look at the histogram up here what that does. So it's taking the gaps in the histogram and it's expanding them out where it's feeling like it needs information. And that does add a little bit of contrast to it. This was shot in camera raw, so I have the ability of color correcting up, a good stop up and down, and still keeping my color fidelity pretty good. Recovery is a nice feature if you've shot some things that have a little bit of overexposure. So let me show you what that does. I'm going to overexpose my image a little bit, and then if you notice this part in the histogram, if I use recovery, it's going to actually shoulder that back. It's going to put a little bit of a shoulder on it so that it keeps those blown out areas from being totally blown out. And for those of you that work in V-Ray and Max and are used to some of the color mapping that gets done in there, that might be slightly reminiscent of what you think of when you do something like a Reinhard color mapping. We'll go back to default so that we're in our main image. The fill light actually puts in some of the information that's in this area. So if I push my black values to be really dark, you'll see how that's really compressed and sort of shot past this end of the histogram. Well, the fill light comes in and actually pushes that back out just like the recovery tool does. It starts to put a little bit of that information back in. And the fill light happens to be a really great tool for going out and shooting interior photographs that you're not able to bring a full light kit to, and maybe you don't have time to do a full setup to fill in some of those lights. The fill light feature can bring back some of those dark areas. Of course, if it's too dark and you've lost the information there, it can't bring back pixels that don't exist, but it is kind of a nice tool to have in your arsenal. Of course, brightness lifts up the histogram in this area. Contrast, you'll notice that spreads out the histogram, so it's actually taking contrast and trying to put more value in between the individual pixels on the histogram. And of course, if I bring it down and I wash it out, clarity tries to do a little bit of sort of an unsharp mask, and that's one of the tools that we talk about in our Photoshop Advanced full class. We get into how you can do some creative sharpening in a non-destructive way so that you can go back in and change it if you ever need to. Vibrance is a nice feature that's been added not only to Camera Raw. It started as a Camera Raw feature and it's worked its way into CS5. Vibrance does a nice job of kind of evaluating saturated tones and tones that are already highly saturated. It doesn't quite give them as much saturation as it does to the ones that aren't as saturated, as well as it protects skin tones. So vibrance is a nice feature for those of you shooting portraits or you're out shooting some vacation photos. Vibrance is a nice tool that it'll keep your skin tones in your images from getting too red, too yellow, too saturated. And then saturation, of course, puts a full blanket saturation over the whole thing. Of course, we can get into our curves and adjust parts of our histogram that way. Sharpening in Camera Raw is a pretty nice feature to have. What you want to do when you're sharpening, though, is you want to look at your image at 100%. So if I drag my sharpening all the way out, you can see what happens if I bring that up and down. By default, Camera Raw, just for those of you that are processing lots of photos, by default sharpening comes in at these values of an amount of 25. There's some nice noise reduction features in here, so if you wanted to maybe blend some of these, this is especially nice if you're working on a low ISO shot at night and you've got a lot of grain in your images, you can maybe get a little bit of noise reduction in there. And of course, we've got some color controls here. We can adjust each of our hue, saturation, and luminance values for any of our color channels individually. So if I wanted to come in here and maybe make my blues less blue and a little bit more towards the cyan, I could grab this slider and do that. If I wanted to make my blues less saturated, I can also just kind of grab those. And you'll notice that some of the film processing work that you can do here, just like you would maybe do in a digital darkroom, also gives you a bit of flexibility when it comes to color grading. And we're going to see in a minute when I open this up into Photoshop that it's non-destructive as well, and I think that's what's really important. This is like one massive adjustment layer on top of an image. So we could go in and adjust the lightness of just that particular color. Whenever I'm resetting this back to 0, I'm just double-clicking on that icon. We can do some things that have to do with split toning. So if I wanted to take my highlights and warm those up and my shadows, cool those down, suddenly I can create a bit of a cross-process look here. If I turn my preview button on and off, you'll see that it cycles through what that looks like. If I hold down Alt at any time, you'll notice at the bottom here it says Reset, so I can go ahead and reset this back to normal. So if you've done something that you don't want to keep, you can go ahead and change that. One of the nice new features inside of this version of Camera Raw, and it's a feature that I use in Lightroom all the time when I'm shooting architectural photography, is ways that you can affect your distortion. So for instance, if you're working with a lens that's got a little bit of barrel distortion, you can actually go in and have the profile of that lens loaded, and it will fix your barrel distortion mathematically so that it straightens out all of those irregular curves that get added from the slight curvature of the lens. Luckily, the lens that I was using for this particular shoot has the least amount of curvature that I probably have ever seen. But the other thing that you'll find nice is that when you're shooting, sometimes you weren't 100% accurate on your vertical alignment, or maybe the horizontal needs to get tweaked a little bit, or your horizon's not 100% straight. You can go ahead and change those. And then of course there's some chromatic aberration that we can use to fix it. I've seen, of course, some people, to make their rendering seem a little bit more photographic, will actually add a little bit of chromatic aberration to mimic those lens effects. We can bring down a vignetting, or if we were getting vignetting in our camera and we wanted to combat it, we can actually go the opposite way. So those are just some nice features that you can do right here inside of Camera Raw to any image. Now, it doesn't have to be a photograph. It can be any JPEG image, any TIFF image. You can actually open that up if you choose the Open As feature. You can open those up as Camera Raw and edit those with Camera Raw settings. So that's a good trick. And they've just added a fully new grain system here. So if I turn this all the way up, you can start to see what that does. That's affecting the grain. One of the nice things, though, that they've done about the size and the roughness is that it actually starts to blur out the image. It's not just this strange noise that gets put on the image. It actually affects the image much more photographically than it did before. And of course, if you have a standard camera setup that you shoot with all the time, you can go ahead and set up a profile so that it would automatically calibrate your images. You could save those presets, and you can do snapshots here. You can also get at your data. Um, One of the nice features, you can do graduated filters here in post. So if I wanted to maybe lift the exposure of my sky, most of the time you're actually doing the opposite. You're sort of bringing the exposure of your sky back down. But let's say in this case I wanted to lift the exposure of my sky, and maybe I wanted to bump its saturation up. I could even do a graduated gradient here, a graduated filter that I put a little color to. And this is nice because, well, it's less stuff that you have to carry on in the field and stick in front of the lens as you're shooting, which is baked directly into the image. Here you can go right into Camera Raw and make some of those adjustments. If there are parts of your image that you would like to get rid of, for instance, we've got a little bit of artifacting here. Well, what we can do is we can actually go ahead and do a spot removal tool. So if I just put this spot remover over the image and grab a area that I want to have it heal it from, and go ahead and do that. If I hit H on the keyboard, that is going to hide those tools, and you can see that now that's gotten rid of those. But the key there is that it's gotten rid of it, but in a non-destructive way. So if that information is still there, if I decided that I wanted to bring it back, I could. Of course, we can crop it, we can reduce our red eye, all those things that you would expect to do. And I can either, at this point, I can save my image. Well, one more thing before we do that. Notice down here where it says the color profile that I'm working in. I'm in Adobe RGB, and it tells me that I'm an 8-bit, and this is my resolution. Well, what I actually do want to make sure of is that I want to tell Camera Raw to put my file at 16-bit. And 16-bit is just a higher color fidelity. There's a lot more colors involved per channel than there would be in 8-bit. And that's going to give me more flexibility in terms of color correcting without banding and so on. So I do want to tell that to be 16-bit, although there is a slight file size difference. And then what I can do is I can either open image. If I hit Alt, I can open a copy of this image. If I hit Shift, I can use Open Object. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Shift and I'm going to choose Open Object. Now, what this has done is this has wrapped up my image inside of a smart object, and that's going to help me out twofold. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop this sky into my comp. And I just did that by a shift drag and let go. And you see that that's a nice high res image. And we'll go ahead and drag this and drop it all the way down to the bottom. That's going to be the sky. All right. And now my sky on the bottom there. Oh, what's happening is that my sky is actually getting chopped by this alpha channel, so I'm not seeing anything. What I need to do is I need to bring this out of that group. So my comp B is that group, and then my sky is below. And now what we can do is we can go ahead and start to move the sky. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to get our horizon line in about the right location. So my horizon line should be right around here somewhere, which of course is my eye level in this image. And now that sky is it's scaled up to be way too big. And if we were to scale this down and not have it in a smart object, that would lose our resolution. But because this is in a smart object, what it's going to do is it's always going to reference that original sized image. So I actually can scale this down as much as I want and not lose resolution later. If I decided that I wanted to scale it back up, I could. So let me go ahead and zoom all the way out. I'm going to place the marker where it's going to scale from right on that horizon line so that when it does scale, it scales and keeps the horizon locked. And so let's go ahead and scale this down a little bit. And then when I hit enter, you'll see that it says it's transforming the document, but I have not lost any of my resolution. As a matter of fact, if I double click on that image, we get this. We actually are able to go right back into our camera raw settings if we want to adjust those, and it's referencing the full high-res, full resolution image. So in this case, maybe what I want to do is bring down a little bit of the saturation, bring up a little fill light, maybe get a little extra brightness in there, and then when I hit OK, it's going to update my sky for me with those settings. So it's still thinking about it here, but there we go. So now what we've done is we were able to quickly color adjust our sky, and you'll see that just with those settings, I was able to get it to match our reflection a little bit better, and so on. Of course, this wasn't the exact sky that I'd rendered it out in, so you'll see that our clouds, we've got a little thing there where we'd want our clouds to maybe show up differently. And so that's a really cool way to look at your images and go through your renderings. It's also a nice thing to do at the very end. If I duplicate this image, and I save this out as a TIFF or a JPEG file, let's say I just save it as a TIFF. I'm going to put that on my desktop temporarily. Oh, before I do that, it was asking me if I wanted to save it out as a 32-bit TIFF. I actually don't. I want to switch this back down to a 16-bit TIFF. So I'm going to go ahead and merge my 16-bit. And here's something to be aware of. When I go ahead and try to merge this back down to 16-bit from a 32-bit file, it automatically puts me into this HDR toning dialog. And that HDR toning dialog is kind of nice, but it's trying to do too much thinking for us right now. It's doing a local adaptation. And what we really want to do is we want to keep it at where we were with our exposure and gamma. So that's the default one. But if you wanted to cycle through what you could get by equalizing your histogram or go through the details of adjusting what your gamma settings might be, these are all ways that maybe you can get some adjustments out of your image. But we're going to go ahead and keep it to exposure and gamma and hit OK. And now keep in mind that you'll notice that now that we're in 16-bit, it says exposure works in 32-bit only. So that also means that if we were to put an exposure on top of our image here and we were to start to expose this up or expose this down, we're limited to that 16 bits of data. And so we no longer have that float data, and that means our file is clipped. So you want to be cautious with how much of this adjusting that you do. So let's save this now as a TIFF file on my desktop. And that should be all good. I'm going to go ahead and discard all the layers. We don't need that. And I'm on a PC, so great. Now I've saved out my image, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to File, Open As, and when I select my image, terrace.tiff, I'm going to choose Camera Raw. And I'm going to hit OK. And so what I've done now is I've essentially given myself all the flexibility of those camera raw controls on my final image. And this is a great place to do some final look and feel. Maybe I do a little warming it up, adjust the exposure some. Here's where I was saying the fill light can really bring in some of those details that are in your dark values. If I need it to be more contrasty, I could bring it up. Maybe we decide that we want to go for a very muted look. We can drag our vibrance down, or a very saturated look. We could bring that back up. We can also go here to our graduated filter, and maybe we give it just a little bit of exposure at the top. That's a little too blue, but for instance, maybe there's a nice bit of blue that starts to wash over our image. Bring down, maybe the highlights are getting a little bit, need a little bit more. We want to watch out for our clipping. If you want to see if something is clipped, you can actually turn on this value up here, and the imagery will show you where that's clipped. In this case, it's clipping the red channel. It's losing the color, that's why it was turning red, but we still have some information there in our other two channels. We can take a peek at what it might look to start to split tone this. And the balance shifts it between how much is used in the highlight and how much is used in the shadow. And of course, this is all these are all corrections that are subjective depending on what look you're going for. I'm actually just going for a look that is different than where we started, so that we could see what we could do with it. And of course, anytime that I wanted to, if I held down Alt, I could reset it and get back to where I was. I could open up a copy of it if I wanted a separate copy. And then any of the color corrections I do here, of course, are non-destructive. So I can always go back in and change it later if I change my mind. I want to maybe cool it off or whatever. So I'm going to go ahead and open the image, and so this is where we ended up. And what we did is we mathematically changed our water selection here. We used a smart object to put in the sky so that we could scale it. Of course, in the class I show you, when we composite images, that's a perfect opportunity to use smart objects for trees and people and those things that you might do a few scaling. You might want to look at a few scaling alternatives at the very beginning before you lock into what it is, so that you don't ever have to re-import the piece. And then we also learn how to do all of these color adjustments and more completely inside of Photoshop. One last thing I'm going to show you before we check out is when you're working in the smart object, and if I just go back to the terrace here and we look at the sky, you can use what's called smart filters. So when I go to filter, you'll see that I've got only a few filters are available, and one of those is blur. And if I put a Gaussian blur on my image, and let's say I blur that way up, and I hit OK, well, what you notice is that my smart object is put on a smart filter called Gaussian blur, and so anytime I want to change that, I can double click it and I can adjust it. So if I want that to be totally blurred, I can do that. So another nice feature of being able to use smart objects and work non-destructively. Okay, well, I hope to see you at our full advanced Photoshop class at the CGschool studios here in Boston. Thanks a lot.